Welcome to Diagnosing Health Care, a podcast featuring thought-provoking conversations about the latest legal, policy, and regulatory issues in healthcare and life sciences. While these issues may seem like hurdles, we'll also look at the business opportunities and solutions that exist. Diagnosing Healthcare is brought to you by the lawyers at Epstein Becker Green, a leading law firm that has decades of experience serving clients in the healthcare and life sciences industries nationwide.
Today on Diagnosing Healthcare, we will discuss psychedelic therapies and the legal and regulatory landscape surrounding this emerging area of healthcare. Hello and welcome. I'm your host, Jessika Tuazon. I'm an attorney in Epstein Becker Green's healthcare and life sciences practice based out of our Los Angeles office. In the 1970s, the federal government classified psychedelics as Schedule I substances, making possession of such substances illegal and hampering research efforts except in very limited circumstances. Over the past several years, however, there has been renewed interest in and attention to the potential benefits of psychedelic treatments, which has led to an upsurge of research in this area. As significant advances have been made, including FDA's grant of breakthrough therapy status to two psychedelic substances, MDMA and psilocybin, and completion of a Phase 3 clinical trial investigating the therapeutic use of MDMA for the treatment of post-traumatic stress disorder, many believe the first FDA approval of a psychedelic for a therapeutic use is likely imminent. On today's show, we're going to examine the history of psychedelic substances in the U.S. and discuss the evolving legal and regulatory considerations impacting the development, approval, distribution, and use of psychedelic therapies in the United States. If you like what you hear today, please subscribe to the show. Diagnosing Healthcare is available wherever you get your podcasts. We have two guests joining our discussion today, Delia Deschaine and Lisa Gora. Delia is a healthcare and life sciences partner in EBG's Washington, D.C. office. Her practice focuses on advising pharmaceutical, biotechnology, food, and dietary supplement clients on a broad range of Food and Drug Administration and Drug Enforcement Administration matters. She routinely advises clients on the federal and state regulation of controlled substances, including cannabis and psychedelic medicine, pharmaceutical drug development, REMS and drug scheduling. And prior to entering private practice in 2011, Delia was an attorney advisor for the U.S. Drug Enforcement Administration as part of the U.S. Attorney General's Honors Program. Welcome, Delia.
Thank you, Jessica.
Also joining us today is Lisa Gora, who is a partner in EBG's Newark, New Jersey office. Lisa advises clients on transactional matters concerning mergers and acquisitions, as well as federal and state regulations in connection with fraud and abuse laws. Like Delia, Lisa also helps cannabis clients to navigate the changing federal and state regulatory landscape. Welcome to Diagnosing Healthcare, Lisa.
Thank you, Jessica.
Today's discussion will focus on psychedelics and efforts undertaken to further investigate potential therapeutic or medical uses for these substances. I am looking forward to discussing with both of you the legal and regulatory developments in this area and recent clinical advancements over the past few years. But before we dive in too deep into the current landscape for these substances and look into the future of where this field may be headed, I wanted to provide our listeners with a bit of background about some of these substances. The term psychedelic is a broad term that generally refers to a class of psychoactive substances that have been demonstrated to alter various perception, mood, and cognitive processes. For the purpose of this discussion, the term psychedelics will include classic serotonergic hallucinogens, as well as products such as MDMA. Psychedelic substances were classified as Schedule I substances in the 1970s and remain on Schedule I today. Schedule I substances are generally reserved for those drugs that have high abuse potential, no accepted medical use, and lack safety even under medical supervision. Possession of such Schedule I substances is generally prohibited by law, and over the past decade, psychedelic substances and efforts to investigate potential treatment modalities involving these substances have continued to gain significant attention and publicity. Delia and Lisa, what are the primary driving forces behind this resurgence of interest in psychedelics, particularly in the past 5 to 10 years? And if you could, please talk about any notable events that might be worth highlighting for our listeners today.
Sure. So there are several driving forces contributing to the growing interest in developing psychedelic, psychotropic, or other Schedule I controlled substances as potential therapies in the United States. Since the Controlled Substances Act was first enacted in 1970, states have moved to legitimize the use of cannabis and cannabis-derived products as medicine through the enactment of state medical marijuana programs. This, in part, has served to reduce some of the stigma associated with the use of psychedelic or other Schedule I controlled substances as medicine in the U.S., which has also, in turn, helped reduce the barriers to developing these substances as FDA-approved therapies. In addition, the federal government has relaxed some, but not all, of the requirements related to conducting clinical and preclinical research on cannabis and other Schedule I controlled substances. This has made it more practical to conduct the research that is a necessary component of the drug development process. The potential therapeutic benefit of psychedelic or other Schedule I controlled substances is not only a matter of U.S. interest, but also one that is garnering attention throughout the international community. This international interest, as well as research that has occurred outside the U.S., has also helped propel the development of these products for domestic use in the U.S.
Yeah, and to add to that, from what I've seen is that there's a growing need for access to effective and safer treatment for certain diagnoses during a time of increased scrutiny over the dangerous side effects of, in particular, opioids, especially fentanyl, and other traditional pharmaceuticals. And then also the need to find alternative therapeutic treatments that can be more effective than existing prescription drugs, some of which have seen to carry the risk of dependence, all in a time as society grapples with deepening mental health issues, which have been exacerbated by the pandemic, where we've seen a rise in severe depression and other diseases such as anxiety or postpartum depression. And the rise of these diagnoses have caused individuals, healthcare practitioners, scientists to be interested in working to prove the safety and effectiveness of alternative therapies that may provide alternative treatments to other drugs that we have seen to cause a risk of dependence.
Thanks, Lisa and Delia. That's really helpful background. Could you describe some of the significant clinical advances that have been made in this area? For example, there have been some substances that have received FDA breakthrough therapy status, and more recently, there have even been phase 3 clinical studies that have been conducted to study certain substances for the potential treatment of mental health conditions. Can you give us a little bit more information on what we're seeing and some of those advances that have been made?
Sure. So while psychedelics have been used in traditional religious and cultural practices for millennia, there have been significant regulatory and clinical developments that have brought these products to the forefront of modern medicine in the past several years. For example, in 2019, the U.S. Food and Drug Administration approved a psychedelic drug, esketamine, for use in treatment-resistant depression. Esketamine is subject to an FDA-approved risk evaluation and mitigation strategy, also known as a REMS, which places limitations on the availability and prescribing of the drug. However, due to the current placement of ketamine as a substance in Schedule III of the Controlled Substances Act, there has been emergence of clinics throughout the United States providing access to ketamine therapy without strict compliance with the esketamine REMS. And this has increased the access and likely the demand for psychedelic therapy in the U.S. There are also several other companies that are following the FDA approval pathway for the marketing of psychedelics or other Schedule I controlled substances as medicine in the U.S. For example, as you indicated, FDA has designated 2 drug products that contain Schedule I controlled substances, psilocybin and MDMA, as breakthrough therapies. And what this designation means is that the products will be subject to a process that's designed to expedite the development and review of drugs that are intended to treat a serious condition, and preliminary clinical evidence indicates that the drug may demonstrate substantial improvement over available therapy on a clinically significant endpoint. Both of the Schedule I drug products subject to this breakthrough therapy designation are intended to serve as mental health treatments, including for the treatment of treatment-resistant depression and PTSD. And I think this is really important for the reasons that Lisa alluded to earlier in her response, in particular, the growing focus, I would say domestically, but then also internationally, on the need for better mental health care for individuals and families, and a desire to cultivate treatment that facilitates that care. At the same time, these products are under development for FDA approval. 2 states, U.S. states, including Colorado and Oregon, have decriminalized the use of psilocybin for therapeutic and non-therapeutic purposes. All of these developments have and will continue to change the landscape for the development of medical therapies involving Schedule I controlled substances, in particular psychedelic or psychotropic substances in the U.S.
Yeah, and in addition to what Delia had mentioned, I also wanted to touch on in 2021, the DEA twice increased its production quota for research of psilocybin, signaling a growing awareness of possible research and therapeutic uses. So not only on the state side, which I can talk a little bit more, but also on the federal side to be able to conduct more research while using these types of controlled substances. Then additionally, the DEA recently granted Cybin a manufacturing license to manufacture schedule substances, including psilocybin, within the U.S. at its lab in Boston. And in October 2021, the National Institute of Health awarded Johns Hopkins University nearly $4 million for the research of psychedelics' potential medical benefits, which is the first federal grant for this purpose in over 50 years. So these advancements really do illustrate the interest that both from a federal perspective and a state perspective that healthcare practitioners and scientists have an interest in trying to figure out whether psychedelics can be used as an alternative to existing diagnoses. In addition to that, there's also now been dozens of universities and research centers conducting studies on the safety and efficacy of psychedelic-assisted therapies that are sponsored by a host of nonprofits and startups. And then additionally, just recently, which I thought was of quite interest, was that in February 2023, there was a political action committee which was formed to elect leaders who support the therapeutic use of substances like psilocybin, ketamine, and MDA, who are hoping to aim and secure federal funding to further educate and research for alternative therapeutics. So it's all ways of signaling that there is this continued cultural shift toward destigmatization of psychedelics. And hopefully we will get to a point where perhaps there will be widespread acceptance of the potential benefits of psychedelics in a therapeutic context. And it's with only all of these steps that we see throughout this long period of time in history till today's date, we will hopefully be able to get to a point where there will be further research in this area.
Thanks, Lisa and Delia. That's super interesting. And you both mentioned some great examples of how psychedelics research has really given rise to some very interesting, promising new therapeutic areas and has been crucial in enabling us as a society to learn a lot more about these products. But there are others who do have some serious concerns about the medical benefits of these products and some of the research that's being conducted in this area. And because clinical investigations involving psychedelics have often involved studies where the substance's potential for use for treating various debilitating conditions is involved, such as for the treatment of substance abuse disorders, eating disorders, and depression. And as a result, there really have been some questions raised about the research methods that these clinical trials really, or these clinical research efforts have involved. Could you talk a little bit more about some of these concerns?
Sure. I mean, I think these concerns do not exist solely in the psychedelic medicine context, right? So they really exist in the development of a therapy for a range of conditions, including mental health treatment, right? The development of SSRIs for the treatment of depression and anxiety also involve concerns around conducting clinical research on this particular patient population. But as a general matter, I would say that there is a stigma, as we've talked about, associated with the use of psychedelics, or I would just say certain Schedule I controlled substances in general as medicine. And that stigma is part of what hinders and creates an obstacle to legitimate research and drug development in this space. There's generally been a historic reluctance by regulators to allow this type of research to move forward without a great amount of oversight and control, and just general skepticism about the intention of the research itself. That isn't to say that concerns around the potential for abuse, and that's a very sort of nebulous term in some ways, for these substances is not real, right? So the Controlled Substances Act, in many ways, is a reflection of the international control of substances under several international treaties. And so it isn't just the United States that considers certain psychedelic substances to have a real potential for abuse. And I think it's understanding what that abuse potential is and how to mitigate the risks associated with that abuse potential, which is really central to the conversation that needs to happen and likely is happening around both the study of these substances in research and the development of them as medical therapies.
Yeah, and in addition to that, what I hear from various healthcare practitioners that I represent is that they believe that the use of psychedelics is, again, currently investigational, and that because it's investigational, there isn't enough adequate scientific evidence for endorsing the use of psychedelics to treat any specific diagnoses outside of what is being currently researched and investigated and has surpassed the various phases of clinical trials that would show that there's more acceptance with a specific drug towards a specific indication. So I think that the nature of it being a psychedelics being a Schedule 1 substance, and which then does not permit much research to be conducted, that certainly just drives healthcare practitioners who are used to basing their determinations and treatments on scientific evidence. And the more scientific evidence and preliminary research that can be observed, documented, memorialized will only assist individuals in the healthcare settings, in healthcare facilities, in medical practices, in academic medical centers, see that there is credibility in the investigations, which may lead practitioners to endorse the use of certain psychedelics for approved medical indications. If we continue to see more widespread acceptance, both legally and culturally, and the implementation of regulatory standards that are created by virtue of the testing and research that is being done, I think that we'll get to a position where we can have more adequate scientific evidence that medical practitioners may rely on and may buttress the ability to use and apply certain psychedelics for certain indications. So I think we'll get there. We need a little bit more time, which is the same thing that occurred in the cannabis landscape, just as Delia had mentioned.
Yeah, I think that's a great point, Lisa. And I mean, one of the open questions right now is how far do we need to get, right, before these substances become widely available for medical use in the US, right? So traditionally, right, in virtually every other context, a product has to be FDA approved before it's commercially marketed in the US, but FDA doesn't regulate the practice of medicine, and so there's an opportunity for healthcare practitioners to prescribe substances that are not FDA approved or FDA approved drugs for off-label uses. And I think a lot of the ongoing conversation that's happening now around the scheduling of some of these breakthrough therapies is really asking the question about how much is enough until the federal government is ready to make broader access to these substances. And so it's a really interesting space to practice in right now because of that open question, I think, that regulators are answering.
Yeah, and even to take that a step further, as lawyers, we, especially Delia and I, we work within what is a regulated framework, just like the controlled substances are looked at to be in a controlled closed system, whereby the use, the administration, the possession, the prescription of these types of drugs needs to be highly regulated. But you weigh that then with the growing public interest and desire to find alternative therapeutics for certain individuals that have tried the traditional pathway of using drugs that have been prescribed to them, and it hasn't been working for them. So you weigh that the regulatory framework against the public interest. There is then the ever compelling need to want to advance the treatment for challenging conditions that we see people have been facing historically and presently. And that then ends up putting us in a risky situation where the use of psychedelics for purported clinical goals may outpace the evidence-based research and the regulatory approvals, because we deal with the public interest in wanting to get this, and then the legislators from a state perspective wanting to implement these types of regulated frameworks, but it's not going hand in hand or in tandem with the approval from a regulatory perspective. And that's where we as attorneys, have to balance those interests.
Exactly. And I think that's a perfect parallel between psychedelic medicine regulation and cannabis regulation in the US, right? That lack of tandem, that outpacing, which it's an open question as to whether that's good or bad. And I'm sure there are risks and benefits, right, on both sides. But that's very well said, Lisa, and maybe a perfect segue to Jessica's next question.
You definitely both have touched on exactly what I was really curious about asking you next, which is this discussion that we've had about the legal and regulatory landscape for psychedelics has really shed light on the complex web of laws that need to be considered, revisited, and potentially changed in order for any approved drugs to be successfully marketed and made available to practitioners and patients alike. So many who are tracking potential legal pathways for commercializing these psychedelic products, like you mentioned, may be looking to the cannabis industry for maybe a little bit of guidance. I think you've both had some experience helping cannabis clients to navigate similar federal and state issues. So what are some of the similarities in the development of these therapies for these types of products? And what are the challenges that these product sponsors and developers face that might be a little bit different that you might want to highlight today?
There are challenges associated with developing Schedule I drug products as FDA-approved therapies, but sponsors have successfully navigated these challenges in the past. So as a general matter, DEA, with input from HHS, NIDA, in particular FDA, must transfer at least the FDA-approved drug product out of Schedule I before that product can be commercially marketed in the United States. And this happens through an established administrative scheduling process. And thanks to changes that Congress made to the Controlled Substances Act several years ago, should happen. It has happened relatively quickly after FDA approval. So there are some concerns related to this historic split scheduling process, which leaves the generic substance in Schedule I while placing the FDA-approved product in a lower schedule. In particular, there are concerns that this impedes the ability for providers to prescribe a non-FDA-approved version of the drug, and it also limits the ability for pharmacists to compound the drug for therapeutic use. There are also research limitations associated with split scheduling because the substance itself remains in Schedule I and subject to more stringent controls. And in light of these and other concerns, members of Congress have recently introduced legislation that would move certain substances out of Schedule I prior to their FDA approval, if they're, for example, subject to breakthrough therapy designation. This is also, the split scheduling is also in some ways subject to litigation that's currently pending before the Ninth Circuit. So the long and the short of it is that the regulation and approval of psychedelic medicine in the US is in some ways groundbreaking. Manufacturers and sponsors don't necessarily need to break new ground to bring their products to market. So there is precedent that those manufacturers and sponsors can rely on. There is a legitimate lawful pathway to bring these products to marketplace. And as a general matter, we've seen companies that honor and follow that pathway enjoy success. Although, as you know, Jessica, it's very uncertain and expensive and complicated. If navigated appropriately and if approved, the FDA approval process can be commercially rewarding.
Yes. And in addition to that, what I've always looked at as the difference between psychedelics and cannabis is one, from a very granular level, both involve Schedule I controlled substances. And there's, for the both of them, a push toward legislative and societal acceptance. However, psychedelic therapeutics do differ from the cannabis industry in several key ways. One being that the goal does not seem to be to create a recreational market as seen in the cannabis industry. Both have gained recognition and acceptance by viewing them through the lens of medicinal and therapeutic potential. And what I mean by that is cannabis was first pushed through in each state through a cannabis regulated framework for medicinal cannabis use. Then, once it was widely accepted within the state through that medicinal cannabis lens, the states then further supported the legislative efforts to allow cannabis to be sold in adult use recreational markets, which now there's 37 states that allow adult use cannabis, 3 territories, and DC. So I find it very interesting that the main similarity between the two is that both from the very beginning were connected by virtue of its medicinal value that people saw. But then cannabis moved into a recreational market, which I do not foresee will happen with the psychedelics market. Unlike cannabis, the movement toward legalization for psychedelics has remained focused on the medical and therapeutic potential, and I'm not quite sure it will lend itself to a lens of recreational use. And just based on some polling that I've reviewed suggests that the public is much more weary of recreational psychedelics. And I'm not sure that that's something that we'll see in the future. And the psychedelics, again, in every single state that has proposed psychedelics in its own regulated framework, where perhaps there's, for instance, in Oregon, as Delia mentioned, it's the first state that has put together a regulated framework for psilocybin service centers, which seems to be similar to cannabis, where you can have various facilities and clinics that would be dispensing or administering the controlled substance. However, unlike cannabis, the psychedelic perspective is that it has to be done through a healthcare setting with the supervision, administration of healthcare practitioners, or at least individuals that are mandated to obtain various certifications to maintain that regulated framework, the regulated standards that we don't necessarily see anymore in the cannabis space. So I think that that's really very, very interesting to keep at the forefront of the discussions of seeing that the differences and parallels between cannabis and psychedelics, because I do think that both were derived from that medicinal therapeutic perspective. Psychedelics will likely keep that focus, while the focus for cannabis has now turned to non-medical recreational adult use market. And now I think psychedelics will certainly benefit from cannabis legislatively, because cannabis did certainly get pushed through very quickly with regards to the recreational markets. And at least from a state perspective, where we have the adult use recreational markets, I think it's been seen that the legislative did push a little too fast because, again, of that public and commercial interest in getting those types of services up and running. There's been various issues with mismanagement of those programs and such. So it only goes to show that with regards to psychedelics, I think that we will continue to see that it's a research-based approach. It's a science-driven approach for psychedelics that will really get us to a more successful market as opposed to cannabis.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And I think that some of the differences or the similarities between the two marketplaces now may be a bellwether for how and whether the psychedelic medicine industry will face the same challenges as the cannabis industry, right? So at the same time that we're seeing companies develop FDA-approved drug products for approval that involve psychedelic medicine or Schedule I controlled substances, there are states like Colorado and Oregon that have followed a more medical marijuana approach to creating access. But the cannabis industry has faced significant challenge in growing and maturing over time as a result of the financial constraints that are placed on it by virtue of the fact that it primarily involves the handling of a Schedule I controlled substance. So I agree with you, Lisa, that access from a widespread perspective and just frankly, the success of the industry likely will depend on how much of the industry is focused on the research and the legitimate drug approval pathway versus creating a legislative state licit psychedelic program that is in tension with federal law.
Yeah, and again, I think just to drive home the interest for psychedelics, again, from the medicinal perspective, is that the psychedelics are being looked at least being paired with therapy, so specifically for psilocybin. And originally, that's what it seemed as though cannabis was looking to do, is that it was going to remain within the medicinal market or looked at as a quote unquote medicine. But that since has changed. And I think that cannabis now is more about the overall commercial interest, the monetary side of the market that can benefit municipalities and states from a tax perspective. And at the beginning, Delia, what you had been mentioning is various business obstacles that these cannabis companies, cannabis establishments face just by given the nature of the Schedule I drug. It was very difficult for them to get any access to banking. It was very difficult for the businesses to obtain title insurance for anything related to their business or liability insurances. And I'm not sure that's the same for the psychedelic establishments. I could only hope that, for instance, in Oregon, where they're setting up their psilocybin service centers, there will also be access to insurances and banking, financing that those businesses can benefit from outside of what cannabis did not have when it first got started in its regulated market. Now, so many years later, at least 5, 6, 7, 8 years later, the cannabis establishments, there's certainly access to banking, there's access to insurance. But at the very beginning, it was very, very difficult. So I'm not sure that will be the same with psychedelic medicine and the research that's going on. I think there will be a different avenue there. And I guess I'll keep track on Oregon as to what is going on there as they set up their psilocybin service centers.
Thanks, Lisa and Delia. I think we've covered a lot of ground in today's discussion on psychedelics, and your insight on this topic has been extremely helpful for bringing our listeners up to speed on the history of psychedelics and the various legal and regulatory considerations that apply today. To wrap up today's podcast, I have one final question for you both. As we continue to wait for new developments from FDA on the approval of any psychedelics as drugs, what are the questions investors or sponsors of psychedelic products or therapies should be asking themselves, in addition to what you've already mentioned, particularly over the next 12 to, say, 24 months?
I think from a business perspective, first off, we're going to see various types of individuals wanting to get involved in this space, from healthcare practitioners to researchers to producers, manufacturers, investors, entrepreneurs. And each of those individuals should certainly make sure that they understand the federal landscape, but also the state landscape, because the two can be very different. And what that means is each state is right now what I call a patchwork of laws. Each state can have its own different measures to protect the psychedelic market that's being created there. Some states haven't approved any type of measures to be able to have any research or business surrounding psychedelics. Some states have looked to decriminalize and have proposed bills in various states to decriminalize the use or possession or manufacturing of psychedelics, while other states have proposed it and rejected it right off the bat. So I think that anyone getting involved just needs to have the advisors assist them with understanding both that federal and state legal frameworks.
Yeah, I entirely agree. And I think in that vein, it's important to keep in mind that the interpretation of State Controlled Substances Act is not something that all legal counsel can do nimbly, right? So that's can be almost as complicated as interpreting and applying the Federal Controlled Substances Act. Some areas where I've seen companies go awry in the past is that they've relied on counsel who aren't intimately familiar with the regulation of controlled substances or even the development of FDA-approved drug products to give them advice about state compliance matters, and have gotten the wrong advice. And it's cost them significant money and energy to address that. And that's happened. I've seen that happen in the industrial hemp space following enactment of the 2018 Farm Bill and understanding what that law did. And I've seen it in other contexts as well. So I entirely agree with Lisa that having the right counsel in place is very important, just to understand the risks and opportunities that exist for the business or the business that you're thinking about investing in.
Yeah, and even just to give a quick example on what we mean is, for instance, if you are an investor that is looking to invest in this type of business, within X state. Each state will have its own framework in terms of, well, can that type of business, say a psychedelic medical clinic, be conducted by regular non-licensed individuals, or does that entity have to be owned only by healthcare practitioners? Does the person that is administering the controlled substance, does that have to be an MD, a DO? Can it be a nurse practitioner? Can it be a physician assistant? Who has to supervise the individual that's administering it? What other policies and procedures should be in place at that clinic, healthcare facility, healthcare setting in order for you to make sure that the controlled substance is being prescribed, administered, possessed, manufactured, if it's someone that's manufacturing the substance, in accordance with the appropriate rules and regulations. And each state is going to be different. So I think from a very, very basic level, I think anyone that's going to be involved in this space, if you're an investor, you should be looking for a business plan from the company that's looking to put on this type of business. And or if you are someone that's looking to start the business, you should also make sure to put together your own business plan that outlines all of these fundamentals so that when you are out there looking for investors, then they at least will have all the information at their disposal for them to be able to make an informed decision and ask questions.
Great. Thank you so much. You've certainly given our listeners a lot to think about today. So Delia and Lisa, again, thank you for taking the time to participate in today's discussion on psychedelics. And thank you to all of our listeners. I'm your host, Jessika Tuazon. If you like what you've heard today, please don't forget to subscribe. Diagnosing Health Care is available wherever you get your podcasts.
Thank you for listening to Diagnosing Health Care. For show notes on today's episode, additional episodes, and more insights on trending issues in healthcare and life sciences, please visit diagnosinghealthcare.com and be sure to subscribe on your preferred platform. This podcast is presented by Epstein Becker Green, PC. All rights are reserved. This audio recording includes information about legal issues and legal developments. Such materials are for informational purposes only and may not reflect the most current legal developments. These informational materials are not intended and should not be taken as legal advice on any particular set of facts or circumstances, and these materials are not a substitute for the advice of competent counsel. The content reflects the personal views and opinions of the participants. No attorney-client relationship has been created by this audio recording. This audio recording may be considered attorney advertising in some jurisdictions under the applicable law and ethical rules. The determination of the need for legal services and the choice of a lawyer are extremely important decisions and should not be based solely upon advertisements or self-proclaimed expertise. No representation is made that the quality of legal services to be performed is greater than the quality of legal services performed by other lawyers.